essentially give up my banking career.
Wow.
But I didn't know what I was going to do. The more pressure parents put on children, it can have very, very weird outcomes. I mean, scientifically, it's proven now that like 95% of the brain develops in the first 5 years. And so whatever interventions you can do in the first 5 years, they really set up a child for life. You know, the parents themselves are also, I mean, there is a bit of a fear factor, right? I mean, you want your kid to get into a good university, to have a good start in life. And that's what allows them to develop to the maximum extent possible for them. And once you do that, then their ability to do things later on and pick up stuff later on is enhanced that much, right? And what happened during COVID was that the parents got a front row seat as to what was actually happening in schools. And a lot of the parents would have come away and said, look, I can do better than this. The economics of the business model don't really work. And I think which is why you're seeing a lot of EdTech platforms continuously lose money or fail and stuff like that, right? So it's a very, very difficult business to make money out of, I think. In the time that the child is 4 or maybe 5, their interaction with technology is essentially at best some sort of a video game where they're punching stuff.
Welcome to Masters Decoded Season 4.
What was your wake-up call? What got you to all of
Honestly,
How do you overcome self-doubt?
so first and foremost,
How do you do that emotional quotient? How do you bring that up?
My next guest on today's podcast is Aniruddh Gupta. Aniruddh is a CEO and founder of Kiddo, a pre-primary education company. An investment banker turned into an academia professional is a fascinating story which you should not miss on hearing from Aniruddh. He has some amazing perspective about education and how the future of education is going to unfold in front of our eyes. If you are interested in the world of education and more importantly, understand his own startup journey, then without much further ado, let me get on with it. Hi Aniruddh, welcome to Masters Decoded Season 4 podcast. Really glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Anis. Good to be on the show.
Aniruddh, I see a shelf behind you full of books. And it is amazing to see. I'm also an avid book reader, and this habit I have inculcated in me in the last 3 years. I would say whenever I used to pick up books, I would sleep. And that habit kind of came back from my good old college days. But I've got into the habit of reading, and reading is of different types. Whether I'm reading digitally, I'm reading physical books. But that feel of physical books is always a charm, which I always enjoy. And great to see some amazing book titles behind you back. But talking about books and the industry which you are in is all about education. Want to know where and how did that got started? Like, what's the story behind of Kiddo?
Okay. Well, I mean, it really started in 2012. So I'd been an investment banker for 14 years. And at the time, we were living in Hong Kong. And my kids were very young. So my daughter was 2.5 and my son was 6 months old. And I had decided to essentially give up my banking career.
Wow.
But I didn't know what I was going to do at the time. So I just got up and quit, essentially.
Wow.
And then I started spending a lot of time with my daughter. She was then going to preschool. And, we realized that, we were spending a lot of time at home doing a lot of the teaching. And, we weren't really happy with the preschool she was going to, and it was very expensive. And so the thing that really sort of struck me was that, and again, like to preface this, we were in Hong Kong and this preschool was a very Western Waldorf-Steiner preschool where it's learning through play and things like that, right? And when I would ask the teachers, okay, so what's my daughter going to learn in the next 6 months or in the next year, they wouldn't really be able to give me very concrete learning objectives. Now, obviously, I've grown up in India and we have a certain mindset when it comes to education and it's typically like, what are the goals? Is the child meeting up to the goals or not, right? And I was like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. I'm paying so much money. I have no idea what my child is learning over there. And at the same time, what I started thinking about was that I really like the more Western play-based style of learning, but why is it not possible to have really defined and stretched learning goals, but um, but delivered in a way where it's play-based, right? Because the main thing was, okay, um, so typically when you think of education, and especially in the younger years, you know, people think, okay, to get very high marks or high, sort of very high, stretchy learning objectives, kids have to study in a certain way and they have to learn in a certain way. And when you think about the Western concepts, whether it's Montessori or Waldorf, etc., or Reggio, um, the general perception is, okay, it's learning through play, but the kids are not really learning a lot, and they're going to fall behind in English and in math and literacy and all of that stuff, right? And what I sort of thought to myself was, there are two different things. There's what you learn and there's how you learn it. And the how you learn can be play based, and the what you learn can be as stretched as you want it to be. And what you need to do is figure out how can you come up with a play based method of learning that still delivers very high educational outcomes in the early years. So that was the sort of initial spark. Did a lot of research in the field. By myself, I got really interested in early childhood education, read a bunch of books, talked to a bunch of people. And then the other thing that sort of I realized was that, the last early years philosophy or pedagogy that's actually scaled across the world is Montessori. And that's 100 years old. And all of the developments and the research and the insights that scientists have had over the last 20 years in early years brain development, they've not really made their way into a very well-defined pedagogy. So the genesis of the business was really to come up with a pedagogy that could essentially use all the learnings from the last 20 years, deliver very high education outcomes in a way that was fun for the children, in a play-based way, and essentially to do that in as many places in the world as we could. So that's how it started, and we started in 2014.
Wow. So, you've shared few things which I would love to double click on. But getting up one day and leaving your investment banking job in an alien country, uh, what were things going on in your mind? Because it's difficult. You have a, I always call salaries a drug. We are all addicted towards it. uh,
Yep.
and you suddenly give up that drug. There is a lot of recall effects, and there is a lot of question marks and a lot of things which go in emotionally, uh, physically, and a lot of things which you could do and now you can't do. uh, what were those thoughts at that time when you just got up and said enough is enough?
So obviously it had been brewing for a few months. I mean, you just don't do it on one day. But the main thing was, like when I left, I was 37. I think I was 37, yeah. And I had been running sort of global businesses for investment banks at the time for about 6 years already, in three different banks, all in Asia, in Hong Kong and in Singapore. And I was traveling a lot, and I wasn't spending too much time at home, so that was a problem.
Yeah.
And the kids were young, so I said, okay, something's got to give out here. The second thing was, I said, look, I'm still relatively young. What do I want to do for the next 20, 25 years of my career? And banking wasn't that interesting anymore, frankly. So that's what prompted the decision. I think your point about the salary drug is a good one. And that took, that took a mental jump, right? In the sense, okay, if you leave, you're not going to get that kind of paycheck, obviously. Um, and so I had to make myself comfortable with where I was from a financial perspective and where I could end up
Okay.
in order to do that. But you know, I had a pretty good run, 14 years since 1998, so I wasn't that fast, I guess.
Nice. Great. And you jumped at the right situation, because now when you look at the entire edtech industry or the education industry, it's ripe for disruption globally. Everybody is talking about how education needs to change. But with that change, over the years which have happened, it's put a lot of stress on children in
Hmm.
terms of, you spoke about goals, and all of that has put a lot of competition amongst children. And when I look back, our parents, you can tell me whether you had that same thinking, that our parents were not competing with the other parents, right? They ensured that they kept the child motivated, they gave all the right resources which they could afford at that time, but they made those resources available to all of us, right? But today the competition is of a very different level, which has put in a lot of stress, brought in a lot of cases of depression and a lot of other untoward incidents toward children. So uh, while the education as an industry is getting disrupted, do you feel that other space of competition needs to evolve and change from a mindset perspective, or what needs to change in that parent's mindset, that it doesn't have a negative effect on a child and a child upbringing?
Yeah, look, I mean that's a very good question. I think obviously the short answer to that is the more pressure parents put on children, um, you know, it can have very, very weird outcomes.
Yep.
And some of them can be good outcomes. Don't get me wrong. I mean, some children will do well under pressure, and the pressure enables them to really achieve what they otherwise would not. But at the same time, the pressure to do certain things in a certain way uh, mostly will be detrimental to a child, and especially their creativity. Right now, from a parent perspective, and I'm a parent as well, and we are living through that. Um, it is very difficult to not compete. I think for parents, because that's what everyone's talking about, and then the parents themselves are also. I mean, there is a bit of a fear factor, right? I mean, you want your kid to get into a good university, to have a good start in life. Competition for university places is stiff, so you want them to start early, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very difficult kind of situation for the children, and I think um, until we get to a point where there are many opportunities available for children in any field that they choose, I don't think that gets resolved. I think it's more acute in India than it is outside India,
Yeah.
because in India your path to, I guess, success, quote unquote, is a fairly narrow one. It's widening now. It's always been narrow. It's widening now, but it's still fairly narrow. The gap between a top flight MBA program like an IIM and second tier
Yep.
in terms of your starting salaries, etc., is very big. Same thing for engineering, medicine, competition for spaces is huge. So, you got to sympathize with the parents, and you got to really sympathize with the kids. The problem is there's just not so many opportunities in a country like India. I mean, outside India, yes, there are more opportunities, but again, the gap between, what you make when you start off, let's say as a Harvard or Stanford graduate versus a second year university in the US, that's huge,
Yeah.
right? And that matters. So, yep, I'm not sure what can be done about it, to be honest. It's just the world that we live in, and it's increasingly getting more and more that way.
Yeah.
And until you get to a point where there are enough financial opportunities or career opportunities available to people in all fields, which is not likely to be the case, I think it's going to remain that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, meaning I see a lot of parents today, And sometimes even, I'm not going to go ahead and say others, even me, like you, I am also a parent to two boys, and when I look around, oh, this person's son is going for karate classes, or this person is going for math classes or spell bee, and all of that, and my son is not going, right? So that inner self of, hey, why is my son, and then those unrealistic expectations start growing up, but and since you're in that early childhood education, want to get your perspective. When do parents really, like, okay, it's building or ensuring that you're thinking for your child's well-being, not today but even in the future, is important, but when do you start turning that knob a little bit harder and harder? Is it right to do it right from day one when the child goes in the first, let's say, preschool, as in your, is a knob should be always
Right.
higher, or should be like, is there a gradual progress to that?
Well, no. So I think the way and the reason why I like early childhood education is for this reason, is because um, you know I mean, scientifically it's proven now that like 95% of the brain develops in the first 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever interventions you can do in the first 5 years, they really set up a child for life, right? And the way we run our programs and our philosophy on this is that children should have a lot of fun in the early years and try out a lot of different things. And for each area of development, we should just stretch them a little bit at all points in time so that they're only slightly out of their comfort zone at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Not completely out of their comfort zone and not completely in their comfort zone, only slightly out, right? And that's what allows them to develop to the maximum extent possible for them. And each child is different, and so the outcomes are going to be different for each child as well. And once you do that, then their ability to do things later on and pick up stuff later on is enhanced that much, right? And so we focus on a bunch of different things. So we do a lot of languages because that's really important for a part of the brain that's got to do with creativity and ability to handle various kind of problems, because you're trying to process like 2 or 3 languages at the same time. So those parts of the brain get sort of developed and fine-tuned. Sports and physical development and all of those various things, like confidence and creativity, all those are really important, and they can be developed at at a very early stage. Now, how a child chooses to develop on them further, how the parents choose, that really depends on the child. Right? I mean, children get interested in different things, and they might try different things, and by the time they hit 12 or 13, they sort of know what they want to do and what they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the interests are much more developed by that stage, and so the kids sort of go into that. But to answer your question, I don't think that there should be any pressure put on the children at a young age at all. I think they should be exposed to a lot of things, and then whatever they're doing, a good teacher at that age should be able to stretch the children lightly or slightly so that they're developing and trying to maximize how much they can learn.
You spoke about the teachers now, specifically,
Mm-hmm.
like you spoke about in the early childhood, that's where the maximum development happens. And we've seen that, right? Teachers who were there in the early school didn't show up in our grades when we were in the 5th grade, or in the, let's say, in middle school or high school. Those teachers didn't show up, and the quality of teachers changed as well and evolved as the period went by. But in your experience, and specifically at Kiddo, do you see that teachers or educators in that space need to evolve? And more importantly, is there a different breed of people who can manage that young child at a very different
Yeah.
level?
So, I mean, for the second question, absolutely. Teaching or taking care of like children between the ages of 2 and 5 is very different from like the age of 6.
Yeah.
And it requires a different kind of person, right? So you have 2 boys. I don't know how old they are, but
15 and 12. Yeah.
okay, 15 and 12. So yeah, so they're like my kids, 14 and 12 now, right?
Yeah.
But when they were 2 years old and 3 years old, they were very different children, right? They're not the same, and so obviously the educators have to be very different as well. The children have different needs at that point in time. The way you teach is very different. The way you enable the children to learn is very different, and it requires a very different kind of expertise and personality, right? And that changes as children get older. You get more specialized and so on and so forth. So yes, and they do require different kind of training. At that age, a lot of it is about care and love and attention, and making sure kids are safe, and their physical needs are being taken care of, and their emotional needs are being taken care of. So there's a lot of that, and a lot of the teaching is blended into that, essentially. Also, the children need to be, the teachers need to be quite adept, and we train them in this, in identifying teaching opportunities when the children are playing, because children are mostly playing at that age, and they might be playing with certain toys or certain things, and the teachers need to be able to identify a teaching opportunity. So you can have like a 3-year-old trying to stack blocks or make a tower, and that's essentially a teaching opportunity on maths, on balance, on geometry, on a bunch of different things. But a teacher needs to be alive to the possibility that, okay, this is a teaching opportunity. And so you don't waste that. And then the children are learning almost organically, right? So there's no set pattern.
Aniruddh, the reason why I've been smiling through this entire, for the last 10, 15 minutes since the time we've been having conversation is because my wife had started a company during COVID, just before COVID, Feb 2020, and unfortunately we had to shut it down in 2021, which was all around life skills. And it was an EdTech platform, and the idea was that the content was free. It was never paid. What she was trying to do, and I was mentoring and I was a guide for her, is she was saying, hey, there's so much of content already out there, but like Khan Academy, you don't have a learning path for somebody to learn how do they acquire these life skills, especially a child. How do they acquire these life skills? Like if somebody is interested in space, then they can learn space, but with that there are a lot of other life skills they will acquire, like curiosity and many other skills which are today very relevant and important in the age of technology and AI. But while she was building that platform with a lot of tech developers, there were a lot of these nuances which we had to take care of because we were dealing with children, right? They don't steer to a path which we don't want them to, or at least they stay on the path. And more importantly, from a security, from a governance, so that was one, taking care of the child. And then the other part was the parent. Like why would a parent sign up for a child, and why would a parent care that these life skills are important? And the reason why I'm bringing that inference here, Aniruddh, is when you are thinking of starting a company, especially in that space, there will be a lot of things you have to take care of, right? Especially if it's a physical setup, there's a lot of many things, right? One is the dimension of a teacher, the second is a dimension of a child, then is the facility, then there is a parent, and today you see a lot of preschools saying, hey, we will report to you live, we will send you pictures, we will send you videos of every child, what they're doing. So there is a lot in it, right? How did you uncover all of these mysteries which you had to do, which you had to set up? Share some of that perspective.
Yeah, look, I think when I started, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I think in the first year, I learned a lot, right? And I mean, I hadn't realized when I started how much I did not know, essentially. And I think that's probably why I started as well. You have to be a little bit stupid, I think, and foolhardy. But as you put up, and of course we had some ideas, and I had some ideas as to what we wanted to do with the facility, what kind of teachers we wanted, and all of that stuff. But once we started, and after about a year, we had a good team. We started our first school in Hong Kong, and then we started in Dubai in 2015. And that's where it all start coming together. So all the learnings from the first year, in terms of where we had gone wrong, how we need to set this up properly, um, all of that start coming together. And when I started, I had three main kind of like, I would say, guiding principles, right? One was that the parent is the client. Uh, so the insight there really was, preschools in most of these cities tend to be expensive.
Yeah.
And so, and most families will have two kids, and mostly they'd be with you for 3 years,
Yeah.
right? So you've got, and the fees, depending on where you are in the world, outside of India, that's something like, on average, $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, right? So essentially, every phone call that you get is potentially $100,000 plan, right? The industry was working in a way that, they weren't really treating each phone call as if it was such a high value client.
Yeah.
And so that was one aspect. So we focused a lot on parent service and parent communication stuff. The second was that, we wanted to make sure that the development outcomes for the children were what we wanted to be, and that we always knew was a long-term project that would take longer. And the third was really, how do you, in a space where you have a lot of preschools that are owned by single operators, right? 15 years, 20 years, one person doing it, that's the norm. How do you get some sophistication in terms of technology? How do you get some aggregation going and stuff like that? Because the industry is very fragmented, and when we started, the use of technology was very, very low and poor.
Yeah.
So a lot of the thing was also, okay, how can we use technology to improve outcomes both for children, but also to make the operations better, right? So those are the three things, and so with those kind of guiding principles, we figured it out and put a team together, and it's been 10 years. So
No, but putting the team together, how easy or difficult was it at that time?
So I have to say I was lucky.
Okay.
Because a bunch of my ex-colleagues and friends from the banking world were thinking of jumping ship at the same time. They all had young kids in different parts of the world. So we sort of came together over a 2-year period.
Nice.
In different parts of the world to do this, which is why we are in so many parts of the world as well. So the core team, which is still intact, came together very nicely. And then after that, we had to hire people, for the specialist functions, whether it was the curriculum and the pedagogy, or different things. But I think our core team was 4 or 5 of us were strong enough, and we taught ourselves a lot of things we didn't know. So I ended up designing all the schools myself. We taught ourselves marketing, and we had a finance background, so that was easy.
Yeah.
Or easier rather. And then the rest of it, we basically figured it out, and hired a bunch of people. Some worked out, some didn't. A lot of them stayed with us. So
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting how the story has evolved, but specifically building an education brand globally and having operations globally, because each country brings its own norms, governance,
Yep.
challenges, and also expectations and culture of how
Yep.
parents look at early childhood education specifically is very, very different. If you look at
Yep.
even the Western world, as they kind of club it, which is wrong. So if you look at the way
Right.
US looks at it versus UK looks at it versus how Asian markets look at it, right? Versus
Yep.
India versus Hong Kong versus Dubai is very different. And even
Yep.
within US, different states and different cities, similarly in India,
different.
very different, right? So how you can't, the word global, which is like you run a global business, but then you localize it in the education space, right? That needs to happen a lot.
Yes, it does.
But how do you build that standard practices which represents your brand globally? Okay, if a child or a parent walks in and they remember this is Kiddo globally?
Right. Yeah. So there are a few things there. So in terms of building a brand image globally, when a parent walks in, it starts with the facilities. So all of our schools look alike, and like even in India, you know, our schools in India will look the same as our schools in London, for example. So down to the furniture that we use, the lighting, the way the learning areas are designed, and all of that stuff.
Nice.
So that is pretty consistent. Um, the second aspect is the curriculum or the pedagogy. Now there we have global pedagogy, but that is then adapted for the local country and sometimes the city as well, right? So we won't run the same language. So English is core, but in the US we run a bilingual English-Spanish program, which we do not do anywhere else. When we were operating in Hong Kong, we were running English and Mandarin, which we weren't doing anywhere else. In Dubai, we were doing Arabic, so on and so forth. But then the program is customized for each country, right? And for regulation. So in the UK, for example, the regulators frown on using workbooks at a preschool level. So we do them in India and the US and elsewhere, right? So the curriculum itself is a bit flexible to make sure that it adheres to local standards. And what we've also done is we made the curriculum so that it's very modular. So in places where certain modules don't work, we just don't use them. In places where the whole thing works, we use it. That's true. And third bit is training. So all of our teachers are trained and have been trained on a global training platform. And the system on which we run our schools, and that's everything from training to the recruitment philosophy to quality control and audits, safeguarding, operations. So all of them were designed in a way that they could be implemented anywhere in the world and guarantee about 95% that we'd have the same level of quality, irrespective of the background of our staff, the cultural stuff that they came with, etc. Right? So it was designed thoughtfully in that way that you have a very strong core that can go global, and then at a country-specific level, you add on policies and procedures so that they adhere to the local kind of local needs. So that's how we put it together. And for us, it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't that hard, mainly because, like in the founding team, me, my partner Philippe, who's in the UK, a bunch of us. So we cut our teeth in banking in Asia, where you don't think one country, you just think multiple countries.
Yep.
That's just the way it is, and you travel a lot. And I've lived I grew up in India, but like I started my career in London. I lived in Hong Kong and New York and Singapore and Tokyo. And so we're very comfortable with the big cities of the world and what the nuances are. So our strategy is much more a city strategy, not a country strategy, even though it looks like a country strategy. So we'd be very uncomfortable going out of London in the UK, but that's because we know London so well as a city, right? So we would find it easier to expand from London to New York than we would from London to Manchester, right? Which is weird, but that's how we've sort of grown up in our careers, right? So you just know certain cities, and then the founding team, the partners that came together, they know their cities, right? So one of my partners was from Dubai, so he knows Dubai. So we started in Dubai, and same thing in the US in Houston. And,
so how many founding members
London.
do you have?
So I'm the founder. The initial team was 4 or 5, essentially. Over the first 2-3 years is when one by one we gathered together, and then people kept changing.
So this question has been eating right from the time we started and before we started as well. And I see a lot of books behind you. So I know I'm going to pivot a little bit. Which one is your favorite book?
Sure. Oh, that's such a tough one. It depends. Okay, my all-time favorite is The Lord of the Rings.
Okay. We
but
share something common then. I'm a big fantasy, whether it's
yes,
series or
yes,
books. I'm a big guy on that.
yeah,
Okay.
so am I. But no, I mean, depending on the, I guess depending on the genre or like what I'm reading, like I have a lot of favorite books. I mean, the books I've read several times.
Very interesting.
But definitely fantasy. I'm a big fan of fantasy. So
You
Lord of
know,
the Rings.
I was watching I watched this channel, and on that they were reviewing. So they were reviewing where you can get business ideas from, and
Hmm.
somebody has actually, if you are interested, I'll share that link with you. Has created, and this was shared on Twitter. As what they have done is all the sci-fi movies which were made or referenced,
Hmm.
or books or movies were made or written, they have created a list of those sci-fi movies, and within that, any piece of technology which they had referred,
Right.
they have put that, and then they show the real mapping, like when did it get released to real
Right.
life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, so it's just fascinating, right? And that's why
Absolutely.
I'm bringing this book reference, is because
Yeah.
we get a lot of ideas by reading these sci-fi or fantasy stuff also, right? Like in
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the good old days of Gurukul, that Gurukul
Yeah.
type of teaching, which I believe
Right.
y'all are also adopting in many ways, is coming back, right? In many ways.
Yeah.
A-
No, definitely.
Yeah. So, pivoting a little bit differently now, in a different direction. Now, you said, okay, you spoke about a customer, a parent coming to you, and
Mhm.
for 3 years, it's $100,000 customer. Isn't there a
Yeah.
temptation now that 3 years, can it be 10 years? A lifetime value from to 3 years, can it go up to 10
Um.
years?
Yeah. So I mean, and look, this is something that a lot of people have obviously raised with us. Like, why don't you go from preschool to primary to
Higher
full school
education.
and so on
Yeah.
and so forth? And um, I'm not saying we'll never do it, but I think that we have now over the last 10 years developed quite a lot of expertise in the early years, and so it makes sense to stick to what we know and what we do really well.
Yeah.
Um, going to primary and then senior school will require a very different level of skill set and the kind of teaching. And also, I think, I mean, if we were to do a full school, K to 12, then we would probably do it very differently, right? I would look at how children learn in kindergarten and preschool stage, which is very hands-on project based,
Yep.
and then try and extend that through the full school, much more a project-based learning kind of method, which then would that jive with a lot of our boards and things like that. So it gets very complicated, very intense. I have thought about it,
Yeah.
but no, and we're not there yet. I don't think we'll have the time. I don't think. I think it'll take a lot to develop the expertise to do that. I think so. And we have a lot to do in the earlier space right now.
Yeah. And speaking about K-12, specifically during COVID, uh, the
Hmm.
biggest industry which got disrupted was education, uh,
Yeah.
including travel and hospitality. But education was majorly disrupted, and it really
Mhm.
disrupted not only the industry but also every child we know of, right? In the way
Yeah.
they were learning, in the way they were going about. So it has really disrupted education industry and the children's mindset. I see. I have. I don't have 8 children, but I have, like, with my nephews,
Right.
nieces, all of them. I have 8 children around, so I can see the disruption it has caused. But there were two unique
Hmm.
trends which kind of picked up. One is kind of dying, or I would say is kind of slowing down the hype it had, which is the edtech industry, and the
Yeah.
second is homeschooling,
Hmm.
which became in a big way. And now in India, I know, which was never heard of. I had always heard of homeschooling in the western part of the world, but in India, homeschooling is becoming a next big thing. A lot of parents are really, either one of them or both of them contribute to a child learning at home. Uh,
Right.
what's your perspective of homeschooling as well as the edtech platforms which came all guns blazing in during the COVID times?
So on homeschooling, Um, I didn't realize that was becoming a big trend in India. So this is news to me.
Yeah.
I'd say it would not be surprising because what happened during COVID was that the parents got a front row seat as to what was actually happening in schools for the first time,
Yeah.
and and a lot of the parents would have come away and said, "Look, I can do better than this for my child," and so why send them to school at all,
Yeah.
right? So I'm not surprised that that has happened. It requires a lot of commitment from the on the part of parents, though.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that everyone can do, I think. Um, I think the biggest downside to homeschooling is that kids don't get to socialize,
Yep.
and they don't have a peer group with whom they can benchmark against, and all that stuff. And that's a really, really important part of growing up, right? So in the US, from what little I know, homeschooling is in communities that all decide to homeschool. So they do their friend circles also within the communities. So they create like a school environment, even though they're homeschooling. So I think that becomes quite important. I don't know how that's playing out in India.
Not yet. It's not community based.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So when it comes to EdTech, obviously during COVID, there was no choice. So people did what they had to do. But I think, though, what people have realized is that there are only certain things that you can learn online, and the rest, like, there's no substitute for face to face. And so, for 90 to 95% of things that you want to learn, especially in the schooling years, uh, the EdTech bit can only be an adjunct to face to face. It can't substitute it completely. And I think that's where people have come to essentially. I think so. From a pure consumer behavior standpoint, if you will, that's where it comes to, right? From a market perspective, I think what the companies have realized is that people don't like to pay for EdTech
Yeah.
at all. And so the economics of the business model don't really work. And I think which is why you're seeing a lot of EdTech platforms continuously lose money or fail and stuff like that, right? So it's a very, very difficult business to make money out of, I think, on any large scale. I mean, that's my view. And that's sort of what's being proven.
Overall, education as a business is not easy, right? To make money in the short term.
No,
If you are
no,
consistent.
no, it's a very long-term business.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very, very long-term business. You have to have a very long-term view. Ultimately, it's all about your reputation and, outcomes for children and so on and so forth. And those only show up over time, right?
Yeah.
And so this is not a business, I think. And this is something that people who are in the EdTech space did not appreciate, is that, this business just takes time.
Yeah.
This is not your classic venture capital kind of, or should not be a venture capital kind of business where, you're expecting to make 20x your capital or 30x your capital in 5 years and high valuations. It doesn't work like that.
So talking about VCs, should education setups get listed? Because I know, I will not take the name, in one in India which got listed, but really tanked in not only in the stock exchange, but they really tanked as a business. Because unfortunately, what happened is they got this investor pressure that scale and
Right.
grow, right? Because like you
Yeah.
said, whether it's a VC or whether it's public market, right? You will always have a pressure from your investors. So should an education institute ever get listed, or should always raise a capital from external?
Well, I see no reason why an education business should not be listed. I mean, after all, a listing is just access to public markets.
Yeah.
So, as a source of capital and liquidity for shareholders, I mean, absolutely it should be listed. There's no reason for that. Now, the larger question is that if an education company is listed, then the fact that you have to do quarterly earnings and like go year on year and stuff like that, does that put pressure on the organization to do things that it would otherwise not do,
Yep.
and therefore, be detrimental to learning outcomes for the children, right? Now, that's the bigger question. And I think the answer to that really depends on how you set things up more than anything else. It's not, if you go out to the market and say that, look, we're going to double every 2 years
Yeah.
and we need to do X, Y, Z, then you're setting yourself up to make certain decisions that may not be in the best interest for the kids, maybe, right? But if you say that, look, this is the growth plan, this is the growth strategy, we're going to stay true to our knittings, and, we will make money over the next 10, 15, 20 years, you might get a lower valuation to begin with, but that's fine, because so markets are all about managing expectations and how you set yourselves up. So I don't think one can say straight out that a listing is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an avenue to raise capital. That's all it is. And what you do with it is really up to the management, right? And shareholders.
Interesting. Aniruddh,
Now, the reason why education, I think, does not work for a venture capital kind of
Right.
financing is because the model of the venture capital business is geared towards, investing in companies that will give you a 10x or 20x in whatever, 7 years or 8 years, right?
Yeah.
That is very hard to do in the education space,
yeah.
right? But the public markets, I mean, you have utility companies that are traded publicly, and they might have lower multiples, but they have steady cash flows.
Yeah.
And that works.
There's another thing which I want to touch base, and you spoke a little bit about it, but I want to pick your brains on that, is technology. And today you see some scary stuff happening, right, in certain parts of the world. Like we saw, I'm sure you've seen some videos in China where children are being tracked using cameras, their facial expressions, all of that during a class, right? And based
Yep.
on that, they are predicting how good or bad the child is going to fare, either in a term paper or in their career, and yada yada yada, right? And we all have grown up being children, right? We were not treated like
Right.
robots. Where do you think the technology line should be drawn, especially when it comes to education?
So I think I would say it depends on what stage of education you're talking about, right? So I'll briefly talk about the early years, which is different.
Yeah, early years and
So-
probably till middle school.
Yeah, well, no. So I disagree with that, right? So in the early years is fundamentally different because in the time that the child is 4 or maybe 5, right? Their interaction with technology is essentially at best some sort of a video game where they're punching stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So their ability to learn from technology is fairly limited, essentially. So you can't have a lot of tech interventions at that age that can substitute for a human-to-human interaction, right? As kids get older, as they get into first grade, second grade, third grade, as we found out during COVID, there are certain things that you can tell the kid, okay, do your homework on the laptop, and they'll do something and stuff like that, right? So technology, as the child gets older, the uses of technology for learning and teaching increase significantly, right? Till obviously you're 16, 17, and you could probably learn everything just online if you were so inclined, right? In the early years, the way I look at it, and I've always looked at it, is like whenever I'm asked about okay, use of technology in the early years, my thing is, okay, there will come a point in the future, maybe 100 years, 200 years down the line, where robots will take care of the kids, right? So between now and then, the technology in the early years needs to be used to give time back to the teachers so that they can, do what only humans can do, which is take care of the kids, right? And what that means is a lot of the things that teachers in an earlier setting have to do, like, do observations about, like, say, a child's physical development, right? Now that can be done with smart cameras,
Yeah.
in theory,
Yep.
right? Or look at, for example, any safeguarding issues that are going on. A child falls down, right? And a smart camera can have an alert ping, right? So you can use technology smartly in earlier settings so that teachers don't have to do a lot of things that they were doing right now on the administrative side and safeguarding side, and they can focus much more of their time on teaching, right? Um, as children get older, I think tech is just going to be more and more invasive. And, I don't really have a problem with that. I think as long as it is used in a way that enhances learning outcomes and, gives more data to the schools, that enables the schools to make better decisions about their programs or whatever, I think that's fine.
Interesting. Now, Anirudh, some amazing perspectives throughout this almost an hour in this conversation. I just have one last question for you,
Mm-hmm.
and when you think about running a global setup, right? And we did touch this a little bit about globalization,
Mm-hmm.
and like you spoke about languages being one of the localization which you all had to do.
Yeah.
But when you think about other curriculums and other subjects which are there,
Mm-hmm.
right, like maths and science
Mm-hmm.
and creativity and curiosity, is there a need for a global standardization around that? Like today in India, for example, there is a national education policy being rolled out.
Yeah.
It's still not rolled out. Schools are getting ready for it, because for that to be done, schools have to change, right? Especially in India, and
Yeah.
every school in India has to change, because that's not what we are set up for. And my child that day was very excitedly talking about, hey dad, we will be able to, not me, but Aman, who's my younger child, will be able to pick up some elective subjects, which I didn't get a
Right.
choice, right? What happens in
Yeah.
US. But is there a need to have a global kind of a setup which does that? Like in India, that we have 3 types of boards and 4 types of boards now. It's getting more and more complicated, right? But is there a need for global standardization around those basic subjects or critical
I
subjects?
I don't know. I mean, I think I don't think that'll ever happen.
Hmm.
So the question is a bit hypothetical, right? Because different countries and within countries, different states have their own view and philosophy on what is appropriate to be taught at what age and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
right? If you look at the sort of hard subjects
Yeah.
like maths and science, etc., you would imagine that like maths is the same whether you're in America or you're in India, right?
Yeah.
And so there should be some sort of standardization, but different countries place different emphasis on those things, right? So what a grade 8 kid in India is doing in maths
Yeah.
is something that probably a grade 10 kid in the US doing that, probably
Yeah.
in the common curriculum, right? So levels are different. Um, and if you look at the other subjects like history, etc., it's always very local, right? You can't and that's a separate debate altogether as to
Yeah.
what that is. Let's not go into that.
I
But,
don't want to get started on that. I have got a lot of strong
yeah.
opinions on that. Anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there will not be a global standard, right? But again, coming back to the early years, the first 5 years,
Yeah.
I think there can be some sort of recognition of what the best practices in the early years are in terms of the way children learn, in terms of the way they develop, right? And how they can get to the learning outcomes that that are needed. Now, at a country level, for example, the UK has a countrywide framework for both early years as well as older years, same as Australia, same in Singapore. So most countries do that. I think that's what India is trying to do with the NEP. I think in India, it's going to be really, really difficult to implement that because putting a framework in place is one thing, but in a country as diverse as India, not just from a language and ethnic perspective, but also from just diversity in terms of the resources that different
Yeah.
like cohorts have. How different groups of teachers at different socioeconomic levels are going to be able to do all this? I have no idea, right? So policies are great, but ultimately it comes down to people and how you train them, and how much resources are put in that,
Yeah.
essentially.
Now, I keep hearing every year it's going to get implemented next year, next academic year, and all of that. And my fingers
Right.
are crossed because I'm pretty excited about it if it comes. May not be for my child, but maybe for our future children in India. Uh,
Yeah.
Aniruddh, this has been a fun conversation, and as I said, education is a very near and dear topic to me. We had a small startup in our own home, so it's always fascinating for me. I always call myself as an educator because I teach on weekends as well. Uh,
Oh, great.
so
Okay.
this topic and this conversation with you further excites me. So thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule, and I really appreciate you doing this.
No, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure talking.